third portion is Ekev, and we are going to today focus really only on, let me put in my AirPods, I'll get a better connection. This week's portion is Ekev. We focus on 3 verses from the portion and try and read what the rabbis say and how we should interpret these 3 verses. So the verses are chapter 8 from Devarim, verses 8, 9, and 10. This is what the psukim say. We're talking about how Hashem is going to bring us into the land of Canaan. And it's a land, a beautiful land. And the verse tells us, Eretz Chita Usaora, a land of wheat and barley, the geffen, the grapevines, Utaina, the figs, the rimon, the pomegranates, Eretz Zeit Shemen Udvash, the land of olives, oil, and honey. Rashi says this is the olives which are produced from the oil. And then verse 9 tells us, Eretz Asher lo b'miskinut tochal balach, the land where you will eat the food without poverty, lo techser kova, the land which is lacking for nothing. We used to think it was lacking energy, but now we know that Israel is also an energy producer. Eretz Asher avanel barzel, the land whose stones are iron, and from the mountains you can mine copper. V'achalta v'savata, you'll eat and you'll be satisfied. V'rachta es Hashem Elokecha, and you will bless Hashem your God, al haaretz hatuva asher nasa lach, for the good land that God gave to you. So the first commentary I want to look at, I'd like to look at a few commentaries. The first commentary that I want to look at is the Baal HaTurim. After the Baal HaTurim, and even though the Baal HaTurim is in the 14th century, I want to jump to that and then go back and read what the Talmud says about these verses. And then after that, go to the modern commentary of Moshe Feinstein. And then on Wednesday, we'll look at the Dudai Ruvain on the parsha. But I'd like to look at first what the Baal HaTurim says, because he has some very nice explanations. First, verse 8. This is halacha. Anybody ever see anybody on when they make the motzi on Friday night, put both hands on the bread? You ever see anybody do that? Put both hands on the bread? You've seen people do that? So what's the source of that? Does anybody know what's the source for that? Okay, this will always make good dinner talk at your table. It says, chapter 8, verse 8, Eretz Chita Usaora, the land of wheat and barley, the land of wheat and barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olive oil, the land of olive oil and honey. Now, the word Eretz is repeated twice. You certainly don't need it twice, and arguably you don't even need it once. But as a total, there are 10 words in this verse. So therefore, the Baal HaTurim, citing the 13th century German commentary called the Rokeach, which translates as the perfumer of Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, says, Eser Tevot Pasuk. There are 10 words in the verse. Vakach tzarich litain eser atzbaot bepat bishat bracha. Therefore, when you make the blessing on the food, on the motzi, on Friday night, you need to have, or really not just Friday night, but in general, when you make a blessing on the bread, you're supposed to grab it. This was prior to COVID. You're supposed to grab it with 2 hands. So all 10 fingers are on the blessing. So that's one teaching that from the Baal Turim. And this is actually something you can put into practice. That when we hold our bread, when we make the blessing, put both hands on it to recite the blessing. Also, says the Baal Turim, there are 10 mitzvot from the Torah that we do directly with bread. And this is another way we can remember these 10 mitzvot. Number 1, lo tacharosh. You're not allowed to plow. What does that refer to? That refers to you can't plow the field to sow the grain. You can't plow that with an ox and a donkey together. You can't use 2 separate animals. That's one of the 5 prohibitions of kilayim, of a mixture, a forbidden mixture. That's the first one. Number 2, lo tizraklayim. You can't plant. You're not allowed to plant your vineyard with mixed seeds. Each seed has to be in its own field. Number 3, third mitzvah, the third mitzvah is the mitzvah of leket. That mitzvah is that you have to leave the gleanings of the field back for the poor people. This is the shechacha and the payah as well. These are other mitzvot. So now we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Shechacha and payah means if you forget something, you can't go back to get it in the field. And payah is the corner of the field left for the poor. Number 6 is lo talsom shor b'disho. When the ox is plowing your field, you're not allowed to put a muzzle on the ox to prevent it from eating. When it's plowing your wheat, you can't put a muzzle on it. Number 7 is teruma, that you have to take a tithe from your wheat and give it to the Kohen. How much? Biblically speaking, any amount. Rabbinically speaking, either 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th. Then there's a tithe to the Levites, that's called Ma'aser Rishon. And then there's a tithe which you bring to Jerusalem, that's called the Ma'aser Sheni. And then there's also the challah. That the challah is the idea that you give a portion of the dough to the Kohen to eat. That's called the mitzvah of challah. Now there are other mitzvot that we could easily include, which for some reason does not include. But this is the Baal Turim's way of telling us that in the same verse that talks about how Hashem is going to bless us with all these plentiful fruit, there are 10 mitzvot in this verse that teach us about the commandment, the obligation to serve Hashem with this food. That's from verse number 8. Verse number 9 stated that this is a land which is lacking from nothing. Eretz asher lo b'miskenu tochal ba'lechem, lo techsar kol ba, a land which is not lacking in anything. And the Baal Turim says that this word, I do want to say that going back to the previous list, that the Baal Turim actually is copying this list from the Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud Chava, chapter 1, verse 6. But there, it omits the prohibition of not muzzling an ox while it plows, and instead puts the mitzvah of bikurim. So the Baal Turim has a different version than the Talmud. Now we go to the fact that there are 3 times in the Bible where it says, you will not lack. One is here that this land will not lack from anything. And the second is the tzapachat Hashemen lo techsar, that the flask of oil will never be lacking. And ubeten rishayim techasar, but the stomach of the wicked will lack. Meaning to say, if you're among the righteous, you won't lack. But if you're among the wicked, you'll always feel like you're lacking. And that's a powerful point, that the righteous never feel like they're lacking. They feel like they're missing nothing in life, whereas the wicked always feel like they're missing something. Hold on 1 second. Okay, and now the next part of this word, lo tachsar, the other thing that the Baal Turim points out is interesting, is that normally, as we said many times, there are 13 letters which have a crown on them. There's a Shatnei Skats, which is Shin Ayin Tet Nun Zayin Gimel Tzadi, and that a Torah scroll is required to have those crowns on those letters, crowns on them. And then there's also the 6 letters Bedek Chaya, which is a very strong custom to have those crowns on those letters. The Bedek Chaya, Bet Dalad Kuf Chet Yud Hey. Reish is a letter that does not have crowns on it. However, the Baal Turim says in this case, Tagin ala Reish. We're supposed to put 2 crowns on this letter Reish. The Sefer Tagin says that there are 150 instances in the Torah of a Reish with two Tagin. And ironically, this word does not appear on his list. So there was a strong tradition to put the Reish here. To put the crowns here. This is to indicate that the land of Israel is what's referred to in the verse, and the first dusts of the world. Meaning to say that the land of Israel was the first place to be inhabited. And now we come to the verse 10, which is a very, very, which is the source of the commandment that you have to recite a blessing, at least after you eat. And Baal Turim will say that it's not only the source for that, the idea that you have to recite a blessing after you eat, but even before. So let's read what Baal Turim says. It says in the verse, you shall eat, be satisfied, and you shall bless. But the Baal Turim does not read the verse that way. He reads it as follows. V'achalta v'savata uveirachta, you shall eat, be satisfied, and blessed. Hainu birkat hamazon. This refers to the birkat hamazon, the blessing after the meal. Okay, that's traditional reading. But then he says, he says, it also, we learn from here that you also have to recite a blessing before you eat food. And what's the source for that? V'achalta v'sevata uveirachta kvar. He reads, and you shall have blessed God in the past, meaning before you eat, you have to bless God. You're prohibited to benefit from anything in this world without reciting a blessing, because the whole world belongs to God. The whole world belongs to God. So before you can eat from it, you have to from anything, you have to bless God. But after you make the blessing, you can eat from your own food. As then it states, but the earth was also given to man. So this is what the Baal Turim says, that this is the source for the idea that you're not only supposed to bless after you eat, but also before you eat. Most authorities, I think every authority says that the idea of blessing God before you eat is only a rabbinic obligation. Many traditions really emphasize, other religions emphasize reciting the blessing before you eat as opposed to after you eat. But in our faith, the main blessing is the blessing after you eat, although you are obligated to recite the blessing beforehand as well. Then the Baal HaTurim states, and you shall eat the achalta, the numerical value, the gematria, as we say, of the words you shall eat, is 457, and that's equivalent to Zelba Kazayit. This is an olive-sized portion. And this is the amount that's often the minimum amount for certain things that a person is required to eat. And then it states, V'chalta v'savata, this is, to my mind, of all the comments, the one that's the most pregnant for analysis is that the Baal HaTurim says, you shall eat and you shall be satisfied. And right next to that, it says, the next verse states, Pen tishkach, be careful not to forget Hashem your God. So he says, Shetzarach lahaskir yom hamisa b'birkat hamazon. The juxtaposition is to teach us that you have to remember the day of death when we recite the Birkat Hamazon. Because you shouldn't forget, because that will cause you to perish. That's later on, the next verse. It says, be careful, do not forget. And then it says afterwards, and you will perish. So what the Baal HaTurim says is that you need to mention in our Birkat Hamazon the day of death. And for this reason, Tiknu HaTov U'Meitiv Al Rugei Beitar Shemignu Akfura. For this reason, when we recite the Birkat Hamazon, the rabbis also instituted, according to the Talmud, that there is a fourth blessing that was added. Originally, there were only 3 blessings, but then the rabbis added a fourth blessing. What's that blessing? That blessing is called the Tov V'Meitiv, the good and the better. And that was a reference to the Haruge Beitar, the martyrs of Beitar who were killed, massacred as part of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. That they were, we saw this in the Gemara Gittin in Hanizakin, that we saw this that in the 5th chapter that they were not allowed to be buried for many years. Hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, their blood flowed from Beitar all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and the Romans would not allow them to be buried. So then Rabbi Gamliel bribed the Roman officials, and they allowed them to be buried. And when the Jews came to bury their relatives, they discovered a miracle that the bodies had not decayed and they were not desecrated. And so therefore, the rabbis recited the blessing of the good and the better to remember the martyrs at that time. But, says the Baal HaTurim, this idea that we're supposed to mention the dead in the Birkat Hamazon is referred to by this verse, V'achalta v'savata, being next to Pen Tishkach. He doesn't really explain what's the major message of the dead being included in Birkat Hamazon. So I'm going to throw that out to everybody. Let me pause for a moment. What do you think is the reason why the rabbis found it so important to mention the dead in Birkat Hamazon? You know, we could have, it's a little bit of a downer. Why are we mentioning the dead? We just had this big meal, and all of a sudden we're mentioning the dead in this meal. So let me just pause and see if anybody has a comment on that. Okay, so there are a lot of reasons why maybe we have to mention the dead in the Birkat Hamazon. And one reason is that I was saying that we have to be grateful to Hashem for being alive and being able to enjoy food. The dead are not able to enjoy food. Another reason is the Talmud says that if somebody sits at a table and does not pray, study God, study Torah, it's as though they eat from the table of Zivchei Meitim, from the offerings to the dead. We want to distinguish ourselves from that. And so therefore, we want to make sure to be praising God with our food at the meal, with our table manners. And so therefore, we're reminding ourselves at a meal where we could be focused on hedonistic behavior, that life is about so much more than the food and the meal, and so therefore that's the reason. One more reason that at the meal we're supposed to praise the dead. And finally, it's the blessing of a tov hametiv, the good and the better. And often at a meal, that's when this blessing is supposed to be recited. So if you have made the blessing on one type of wine and then a better wine is brought out, you've already recited the blessing on the wine. So what do? So then you would recite the blessing of the good and the better. So sometimes our table overflows with food, and we don't even focus on it, and therefore we recite this blessing. And they recited it. You would have thought that when the rabbis instituted this blessing, it was for a meal. It was for something that you could say is not really good. To be able to bury your dead, it's such a small thing. I mean, your dead were massacred. But the idea that we have to be grateful for even the smallest of blessings, that's certainly something that was found in this blessing of Atov Hametiv. Okay, so now I'd like to go back to verse 8 and to start focusing on where these verses are recited, are cited in the Torah. And I found this beautiful source called the Chamishe Chumshei Torah with the Midrashei Halacha, with the explanations of the Rishonim and the Achronim, and it was collected by Yechiel Michel Stern, and he's a rabbi in Ezra's Torah in Yerushalayim. So this is what do we say about the verse? Going back to the first verse, Eretz Chita Usaora V'Gefen Usaena V'Rimon. So he first starts by saying, from the Talmud in Brachot 41a, Amar Rav Yosef, that Rav Yosef taught, and some say Rabbi Yitzchak, Kohen Mukdam b'pasuk seh, Mukdam bracha. Anything which comes first in this verse is going to have the blessing on it recited first. As it states, the land of wheat and barley, figs, wheat, barley, grape, figs, pomegranates, the land of olive oil and honey. What this means is let's say you have in front of you wheat and barley. You're supposed to make the blessing first have in mind and eat first, even though wheat and barley are the same blessing if it's in the bread form of hamotzi. So let's say you have a loaf of wheat bread and a loaf of barley bread in front of you. How do you know which one to eat first? Because after you make the blessing, you're supposed to eat the more distinguished food. So the Talmud tells us that you eat the food which is closer to the word land before the one that's farther away. So you would eat the wheat before the barley, then the wheat before the grapes before the figs, and the figs before the pomegranates. So that is what the Talmud says, is based upon the fact that it says the word land in proximity to each of these verses. Yes, I will just pause for a second. Hold on. So now we go back to the special commentary that we have, this new commentary. It says, Rav Meir Simcha, I assume he's referring to Rav Meir Simcha in our tradition, has referred to several different people, but I assume he's referring to the Meshech Chachma. He explains that in Egypt, there was no oil and honey. Interesting to think about that. Because we find that Joseph, he sent to Joseph from the Zimrosa Aretz, from the best of the land. What did he send? What did Jacob send Joseph? A little bit of honey. He sent him a little bit of honey. And then it says that when they were complaining to Moshe, they said that it's the Mitlonanim said, why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us to this bad place? It's not a place of seed, wheat, grapes, and pomegranates. But they didn't say it's not a place of oil and honey, because also in Egypt they didn't have honey. And therefore, Israel was the best known for its oil and its honey. And so therefore, it says Eretz Shemen and Vash, that's why it's separate from the rest of the verse. Why are oil and honey separated from the earlier parts? So Rameir Simcha, the Meshech Chochmah, says it's because the earlier fruits also appeared in Egypt, but the oil and honey, they did not appear in Egypt. Okay, another verse that he cites from the Talmud, also found in Brachos 41a. So what else do we learn from this verse? Eretz Tita Usaora. So Rabbi Hanan taught all this verse was intended to teach us shiurin. What do we mean by shiurin? Measurements. What do we mean by that? How much each one of these elements is teaching us a measurement for which we have liability. Like, for example, at what point is the threshold that is required? So, for example, the Talmud says, Klita, what do we learn from wheat? So, that if you enter into a house in which the house was tamei because it had leprosy on it, then you become tamei. But after how long do you become tamei? Is it immediate? So the answer is it's the time that it takes you to eat a loaf of a half a loaf of wheat bread. So that's the time. So that's the time in which you have liability. What's barley? If you have a bone the size of a barley corn, a dead body, and you touch it, you become tamei. What's wine? What do we learn from wine? That if a Nazirite who's prohibited to drink wine drinks a quarter of a lug of wine, usually they say that's 4.4 ounces of the wine, they violate their vow. But if they drink less from it, then they're not in violation. A fig, that's the amount. If you have a dried fig and you carry that in the public domain on Shabbos, you're going to be liable. What's a pomegranate? So that is the minimum size of a utensil in order for a utensil to become tamei, it has to be functional. And the minimum size of functionality is that it's able to carry a pomegranate. Then we have the land of oil. What do we do with oil? So it says all of the baseline measurements. If we don't know a specific measurement other than that, then we assume that the measurement is an olive. So meaning to say most of the measurements are based upon the olive. It was an olive-based system. Like, for example, eating blood, eating forbidden fats, those are based upon an olive. What's honey? So this is date honey, and this is the amount that you have liability of kares on Yom Kippur, is if you eat a kotevet hagasa, if you eat this date. So that's a large date, then you have liability. So, okay. Then the Talmud also tells us another law, that if you eat any of these 7 species, you're commanded to recite a special bracha achrona, a special final blessing, which is more significant than all other foods. So ironically, if you eat meat, you just required, if you just eat a piece of meat, you're just required to recite the Borei Nefashot at the end of the meal, assuming that's all you ate. You could eat a $1,000 steak, and at the end, you're just required to recite the Borei Nefashot. And you can be completely full from that steak. But if you eat a grape, or like a few grapes, then you have to recite what's called the Berachot Me'in Shalosh, which is a much longer blessing and more developed blessing. This is the Mishnah in Brachot. I'll read the Mishnah. If a person eats the figs, the grapes, the figs, and the pomegranates, you have to recite the 3 blessings, the Birkat Me'in Shalosh, which is a shorter version of the Birkat HaMazon, which has 4 blessings, and the blessings are longer. That's the position of Rabbi Gamliel. And that's the position of Rabbi Gamliel, whereas the Chachamim say, Bracha Achas Me'in Shalosh, that you recite 1 blessing, but it has elements of the 3 in them. Meaning to say, Rabbi Gamliel says recite 3 blessings. We don't we don't rule like that, but we follow the position of the rabbis who say you say bercha achas me'in shalosh, that you recite one blessing, but it has summary of the three blessings in them. What's the reasoning for Rabbi Gamliel? Because it says Eretz Chita Usaora, Eretz B'Miskinita Sherut Tachal Ba'Lechem, and then it says V'chalta Misavata Ve'rachta Hashem Elokecha, which means to say that this obligation to bless afterwards refers to all of these special species. Whereas the Rabbanan say that the land Eretz interrupts it, and so therefore the obligation to recite this full Birkat Hamazon only refers to if you eat the bread. But we see from here the very, very important point that if you recite if you eat these foods, these seven species, you minimally have to say the bracha achad me'in shalosh, the berachos me'in shalosh, okay. So that's that point. Now, is the blessing beforehand, biblically speaking? So we had said almost all authorities rule today that the blessing afterwards is biblical. The blessing after you eat is biblical, but the blessing beforehand is rabbinic. However, not everyone says that. So the Jerusalem Talmud said that also the blessing beforehand is biblical, and it also the Zohar, the classical mystical work, says it says that there is a commandment to bless to God for everything that you eat and drink or benefit from in this world. So he says it's a commandment you're obligated to, and so too. So too there are some authorities. He quotes here the Meiri, Rabbeinu Peretz. Now let's say you sit down to eat your bread and you forget, and don't say this doesn't happen. It happens to me often. Do you forget whether or not you recited the blessing beforehand? So you might say, oh, well, what should we do? So there are some authorities who say that because the blessing over bread is biblical, you're required to recite the blessing again before you eat it. So according to those authorities, like the Meiri, the blessing beforehand is also biblical. And indeed, the Pnei Yeshua says also the very idea, the logic that you're not going to benefit from this world without making a blessing is logical. But we have a concept that logic is also a source. Logic also is a biblical source. Ironically, even though there's no verse, the logic is just as powerful. And so therefore, he says it's biblical. And also some say that if you have to bless God when you're full, after you eat, for sure you're supposed to bless God when you're hungry. So therefore, for all these reasons, even though the common conception is that the blessing beforehand is only rabbinic, there are many sources that seem to indicate that it's biblical. So for sure, we should not take this mitzvah of making a blessing before we eat, before we put anything in our mouth. We have to recite the blessing, and many see this verse as a source for that. So according to those who say that it's rabbinic, when was this blessing established? So the Rashba writes that the blessing beforehand is rabbinic, and the verses are only a support, but they're not biblical. So if that's the case, when was it established? So usually we say that the blessings were established during the time of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. But in this case, we say it was established by the prophet Shmuel Hanavi. And so therefore, he says, because it says in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 13, that it says in the chapter where Saul was looking for Shmuel, he says, where is Shmuel? And they said, well, Shmuel is there. People are waiting for Shmuel to come, and he'll make the bracha, and then they can eat. So we see from here that the Talmud says, from here we see that they had not yet established the idea that you can't eat without a blessing. It's just when Shmuel was there that they had that practice. So that's a dispute. Okay, so now we turn on to the next law with respect to these 7 species, and this is the law of the bikurim. The bikurim, which is the first fruits, come only from these 7 species. Now, what's the law? The law is that when you see a new fruit growing in your field, you go down there and you tie a band around it, and you say, "This is for my first fruits. This is for the bikurim." And the Talmud tells us in the Jerusalem Talmud in Bikurim, the very, very beginning of the tractate, you only bring the Bikurim from the 7 species. So, and what's the basis of this? It's only from these 7 fruits can you bring these first fruits as a gift offering to the Kohen. And the Talmud says, because if it had said, if it had said you shall take from the first fruits of all the fruits of the land, I would say that everything is obligated on the Bikurim. But here it says, Artzacha, and it says by this verse, Eretz Hitu Sa'ora. So therefore, we learn from here, we do comparison that it only relates to the 7 species. And we see from here the fundamental idea that the mitzvah of the Bikurim only comes from the 7 species. And that's the source for this idea. Let me just pause for a moment, see if anybody has a question before we. Okay, so let's go now to verse 10. It says, "You shall eat, you'll be satisfied, and you make the blessing." Dorish Rav Avira, Zimnin Amalei Mishmei Rav Abi, Zimnin Amalei Mishmei Rabbi Asi. That Rav Avira taught that, and sometimes this was taught in the name of Rabbi Ami, and sometimes in the name of Rav Asi. Amru Malachei Ashares. The ministering angel said before God, "Master of the universe, it says in your Torah, Asher lo yisapanim v'lo yikach shokad," that God is somebody who does not show favorites, who does not take bribes. V'alo atanosei panim Israel, but you do show favoritism towards the Jewish people. But it says Yisa Hashem panav elecha. It says in Parashas Naso that Hashem will turn His face to you. So Amar Lahem v'chilo asa panim Israel. So God responds, should I not show favoritism to Israel? Because it says in my Torah, you shall eat, you'll be satisfied, and you bless Hashem your God. That so even though the verse says that you have to bless God when you eat and you're satisfied, but we, our ancestors, were strict upon ourselves that even if we weren't satisfied, even if we just ate the size of, here it's very careful to say ad kazayis v'akabeitz until the size of an olive and the size of an egg, then we still say that you're obligated to recite this blessing. And because we are so careful to bless God for the food that He gives us, therefore, for this reason, God shows a quote-unquote favoritism towards the Jewish people because of the way we bless God when we eat. So he has a commentary on this. So he has a commentary on this that it states, Adam she'ochel harbe ein kiddusha chol olav. If a person eats a lot of food, holiness does not fall upon him. And in the days of Rabbi Yosef Kubo, so the Chidah brings down this story. Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, he brings down this story in his book called Simchas HaRegel, and this is Haggadah, that in the days of Rabbi Yosef Kubo, there was an incident that many people were wandering after one man, and they thought that he was a holy man of God. And Rabbi Yosef Kubo ordered them to check when he ate. And he said, check out this man, see how he eats. And they said, he eats a lot of food. And he said, well, then he's not a holy man. Because the holy man is very careful. They don't rush for the food. They're very careful to discipline themselves and eat only the proper amount. Indeed, we find this in the Zohar. It states in the Zohar, "V'itzchach tu yishtakech b'lan al p'torah, da b'lanu misitra achrei avi." That you should not be a glutton on your table, because if you're a glutton, that comes from the sitra achra, that's like the sinister side of us. And what's the secret for this? Because it says, "Haliteni na orach balanu, v'hachi itzchach sitra achra, u'betem rishayim techaser." So that's from Esav. He says, "Haliteni na." And so he said that's why it says in the verse, the stomachs of the wicked are lacking, meaning to say excessive eating, overeating, which is unfortunately a quality that I see a lot of in the Jewish community. That is, according to the Zohar, a sign of the Sitra Achra, which is basically another way of saying of the Yetzer Hara. So that if we want to improve ourselves spiritually, we'll limit ourselves as it relates to food to only eat the proper amount. I'm not saying you can't eat, obviously, but it's saying to eat the proper amount and eat it in a proportional manner. So the Birkas Hamazon is, the Sefer Chinuch writes about the obligation of reciting a blessing after you eat. He says, Kasav Kach, the Sefer Chinuch, the 14th century anonymous work, writes as follows. I have a tradition. Shekol Hazahir b'Birkas Hamazon. Whoever is careful about the mitzvah of reciting the blessing after we eat, mizonosav mitzuyalo b'kavod kol yamav. His parnasa, his food, will be always found for him his entire lifetime. If he's careful about the mitzvah of reciting the Birkat Hamazon after he eats, then he will always have. Hold on. Okay, so if a person is careful about the mitzvah of Birkat Hamazon, then God will make sure that he always has food to eat. He will always have parnasa. So that's something that we should do, because Birkat Hamazon is a statement that we're thanking God for the parnasa we have. And so the Be'er Ekev writes that the letter, I never realized this, the letter pay is not found in the Birkas Hamazon. And the reason is that whoever makes a blessing on the Birkat Hamazon with the proper intent, Ein Shoet Bo, Lo Af V'Ketzef, anger and wrath will not be upon him, and his mizonos will always be found b'ravach u'b'kavod. So therefore, the Be'er Ekev says that the letter pay is not found in the Birkas Hamazon, because whoever recites the Birkat Hamazon properly will not have wrath or anger from God. That's what the Sefer Chinuch says. The Sifsei Kohen writes, he says, I heard that whoever makes a blessing on anything that he eats, and he never ever eats anything without first reciting a blessing. Okay, listen to this one. You might be skeptical of it, but listen to what he says. First of all, there's probably nobody who ever did that, so that's why he could say this. But he says that whoever never ate anything without first making a blessing, when he dies, the worms will not be able to rule over his body, because the worms are part of the curse. And the blessing is the opposite of the curse. So if a person is always careful to recite the blessing, the worms will never rule over him. And he'll bring the blessings with him into the grave. And there's a source for this from the Midrash. It says in Mechalta, Zeirachta, it says, if you make the blessing, then I'll place upon you all the good in your body, and your body will not disintegrate. And the Sefer Hasidim writes, there was an incident with one person that he died many years before his time, and after 12 months, they dug up his remains for some reason, and they said, he appeared to his relatives and he said that every single day they judge him and they say you should have been more careful with your blessings. And so therefore he says, I came back to you to tell you this, to teach you that we should be careful about reciting the blessings. I'll say this, that the idea of reciting a blessing before we eat food is such a primal behavior. So if we recite the blessing before we eat, we're trying to take the concept of eating and elevate it to a concept of spiritual and holiness, and take this primal activity and turn into a spiritual path. And so therefore it's a very, very simple thing that we can all do before we eat to elevate the animalistic practice that we're about to enter into. The obligation to learn the laws of the blessings, the sages said that you're obligated to go to a chacham and ask him to teach you the laws of brachos. And through the blessings, we can tell whether or not the person is a Torah scholar, because it says in the Elia Rava, Haiman the Bayim Chasid, if a person wants to be pious, he should uphold the words of the blessings. And so therefore they ask about that. What do you mean? If you don't feel it, if you're not careful about the blessings, you're not called a chassid, you're violating the law. It means to say that you make it upon yourself that you determine not to eat a food until you know the proper blessing in the food. There are many foods that are very complicated. Like, for example, what blessing would you make on sushi? How would you know what blessing to make on it? So you're very careful that when you eat the sushi, you first recite motzi. So therefore, it's not a question which blessing. You could be mizonos on the rice, or adama on the vegetables, or maybe sha'ako on the fish. You don't know what blessing to make. So therefore, you're very careful that before you eat the sushi, you would recite a motzi on the blessing. A big problem at the weddings. At weddings, a lot of people are at weddings. Very few people I see are washing before they eat, and then also they don't know when the meal ends, so they forget to do their blessing. They leave early. They forget to do the birkat hamazon. And when are you supposed to recite the blessing more than at a wedding? A wedding is a feast, and everybody's there. You're eating like you're really enjoying your food. So therefore, this is a very tremendous inspirational message for us to make sure that we are careful about something very small in life, but it will impact us forever if we're careful about the blessings. So we saw a lot of halachos today, halachos about the fruits of the land of Israel and the obligation to recite blessings as a way of improving ourselves spiritually and coming closer to Hashem. I'm going to stop here, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address them.